Hannah Arendt wrote back in the early 1960s in an essay that described how the freedom argument for war only emerged around the time of World War I, when all the other arguments had sort of been made invalid by the very nature of modern warfare. She said in that essay, "Is it too much to read into current, rather hopeless confusion of issues and arguments a hopeful indication that a profound change in international relations may be about to occur, namely the disappearance of war from the scene of politics? Could it not be that our present perplexity in this matter indicates our lack of preparedness for a disappearance of war, our inability to think in terms of foreign policy without having in mind this continuation with other means," quoting Clausewitz, "as a last resort? Could it be, taking the really big view of history as a human evolution, as a movement toward what appears to be, at least in my mind, a species consciousness unlike anything else that has ever existed on the planet? Could it be that our insistence that we have the right to make aggressive war as a continuation of politics by other means is in fact an effort to stop this evolution in its tracks, an effort to make the world safe, or excuse me, make the world ready again to experience war as a continuation of politics?" My last factual point is that in its annual report on last year, the Stockholm Institute of Peace Research declared that last year was the most peaceful year since it began keeping records. There were only 2 interstate wars ongoing in the world, one in Afghanistan, one in Iraq. There were civil conflicts, but those were the only interstate wars.
We will now have 5 minutes for a second affirmative rebuttal by Mr. Hanson.
You cannot have classical deterrence if you don't have a military, because until the nature of man changes, nobody's going to be awed or think that any bad thing could happen as a wage or the result of their murder, unless they think something worse could befall them. That can only be possible if you have a large military budget. As far as World War II, again, I don't want to replay the past, but I look at it a little differently, that war is never the choice between wonderful or bad, but something better and something worse. Once Hitler and Tojo and people like that were in control over a policy of appeasement, you had no good choices. The choice was war or the annihilation of millions in peace. We chose war. It was the lesser of 2 evils. And it wasn't characterized as was implied that war brings out the worst in man. War can bring out good things, sacrifice, duty, honor. These are not things that of 19th century to be thrown on the dustbin of history. Professor Edsforth asked, can we learn? We are learning. And his last statistic was proof of it. There's only 2 wars. Just 10 years ago, it was not uncommon to have 20 or 30 wars. And why are there only 2 wars? Because with the end of the Cold War, the United States did not disarm. And it has a policy. It runs up enormous trade deficits, over $100 billion a year with China, to get China onto the global commercial scene. It runs $50 billion with Japan. It tells Japan and Germany, do not go nuclear. We will keep China and the sea lanes in Korea open. We tell the Greeks and the Turks, don't fight in the Eastern Mediterranean. Adjudicate Cyprus. We tell the Europeans, bring in Turkey, even though that's controversial, into the EU. It's not that we are promoting war, we're trying to foster democracy. There are more democracies in the world than ever before because democracies have a historical tendency not to make war on one another. And therefore, that's precisely what we're doing in Afghanistan and Iraq. There was no way in the world that Mr. Saddam Hussein, after butchering 1 million of his own people, attacking 4 countries in 10 years, practicing genocide, was going to put down his arms. And that as long as he would not do that, there would never be a chance for democracy in the Middle East. It's precisely because of a utopian vision that Mr. Bush and his advisors are hated and despised by the paleo-conservatives, the isolationists, who I never thought in my lifetime that Noam Chomsky and Pat Buchanan would have an alliance of convenience, but they both do, because they both, from different angles, deeply resent the idea that American force and treasure and sacrifice would be used for something idealistic, to echo the words of Woodrow Wilson. And I, more than anyone, I agree completely with Professor Ellsworth that we have to change our policy with strong men. And the United States, unlike Europe, has told the Saudis to change, has gotten our troops out of Saudi Arabia, has told the Egyptians to change, is trying to change the Kuwaitis, and is running a very great risk with the world's oil supply. If you want to see the power in the world that wages aggression and doesn't follow the rules of international law and commerce, it's not the Americans, it's the Chinese. As we speak, they violate every trade agreement, and they try to use real petroleum politics. And so I think for all our faults, just because, as the Romans said, sumus homines non Dei, we're just humans, we're not God. Just because we're not perfect doesn't mean we're not very good.
Thank you. Mr. Edsforth will now have 5 minutes for his second rebuttal.
Well, where should I start? Undoubtedly, Saddam Hussein was not going to change, but he was going to die. And perhaps, given all the restraints and all the forces of deterrence that were acting on him, enough to, in fact, have him totally destroy and abandon his weapons of mass destruction program, for instance. When he died, the people of Iraq would have created a situation in which an intervention by the United States and other countries, I would hope under international auspices, would have produced a less destructive result than our aggressive war has produced. Iraq, large parts of Iraq are destroyed. There's enough reconstruction work there to keep Halliburton in profits to the middle of this century as a result of our intervention. There's more than 1,400 American soldiers dead. There's 1,450. There's 208 American contractors dead. There's 770 American soldiers wounded. Many of them having to be evacuated, half of them not able to go back to active duty within 3 days. By the most conservative count, there's now almost 18,000 Iraqi civilians who have died. And this country is in no condition to function normally for years to come under the best possible circumstances, a concerted international effort to help it recover and reconstruct itself. These were high prices to pay. And I'm enough of an American nationalist, actually, to say that they may be too high for the people of the United States to pay. Too high, especially when you consider the other prices that we are paying. And if you've traveled in the world, you know that Americans are looked upon differently now than they were before the attack on Iraq. It's going to take a lot of hard work to rebuild our image in the world. Most people around the world still admire this country for very good reasons. It's a place of incredible prosperity, a land that permits a large degree of individual freedom. I feel a little worried that the situation we're in, this transformation of an unpopular war in Iraq as a war against terror into what might be a more popular war against tyranny, having the same temporal dimensions, that is, lasting at least a generation, or in other words, till I'm dead and gone,